Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah, today's topic is technology and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. And in terms of understanding this discussion, I want to touch upon, I think, three different areas to help us better understand why I chose this topic, but more importantly, why I think it's important for us understanding some of the geopolitical tensions within the region. So first, I want to touch about what technologies I mean. Second, what are some of the institutions that have emerged to try and compete or outcompete in this particular area? And then three, maybe talk about this technology and the geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and what does it mean for the region's evolution. So in terms of technology, I think the broader and most important technologies that we're thinking about really started in about 2017, 2016, when we were having a lot of discussions about 5G technologies, about the role of Huawei in building our telecommunication systems, and the use of something called dual-use technologies. So semiconductors that are produced, for example, by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. These very, very high-tech semiconductors are used in everything from iPhones to fighter planes. So they're really exciting, they're very powerful, and they're very useful. And there was great concern about China's PLA, People's Liberation Army, using these kinds of technologies to very, very quickly modernize their military so that they could really compete head-to-head, toe-to-toe with their primary peer competitor, as they understand it, the United States. Some other important areas, though, as well, I think are really important, is not just thinking about 5G and semiconductors, but thinking about digital infrastructure and the standards that will emerge as these technologies become widely available to this region, but also the global region. Why this is important is that basically the country or countries that make the rules for the digital economy, make the rules for cellular technologies, will reap the most benefits in terms of financial benefits, but also creating the rules and regulations of how these technologies are going to be used. So if we try to understand this in terms of something that we all use every day, and that's the internet, and we think about all the internet protocols that are out there, HTTPS, and how we use the idea of websites, how we use the idea of IP protocols. All of this digital infrastructure was really produced in the United States, and as a result, they evolved and they developed with a U.S. market in mind, and then they were gradually adopted by, of course, most other countries. Now, we see the tensions in terms of technology and things like the internet in terms of thinking about something called cyber sovereignty. So countries like the United States have an idea of cyber sovereignty, but it's very, very, very different than, I think, China and Russia, who really want to ensure that the internet space is not a space without government control and the ability for the government to shape what is being seen and how the internet is being used in their countries. So when I'm talking about the digital architecture and technology, I'm talking about also the standards that are going to be produced and used to use these technologies for commerce, for governance, and for privacy. And that's important. So I mentioned 5G technology. We'll probably move into 6G. I mentioned semiconductors. I mentioned digital standards. AI is another important area. So artificial intelligence, but also augmented intelligence. These are forms of computer programming that will help us really fundamentally change how we produce knowledge and how we engage in problem solving. And there's a great new book by it's called The Age of AI by Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt. And they write very much, and I think it's a quite clear-eyed view of the world, of how AI is going to fundamentally shape how we think about governance, how we think about privacy, how we think about problem solving. It will produce new technologies, from computer technologies to biotechnologies and building drugs. vaccines. So we've seen that AI has been used in producing some of the vaccines that we've used during the COVID pandemic. So AI is another area when we're talking about technology and competition in the Indo-Pacific. Is the country that is the first mover on AI, that will have the most powerful AI technologies, will likely be able to produce the new technologies, synthetic technologies, biotechnologies, and other forms of technologies that will be used to produce value, produce wealth, to modernize their economies, to make their societies more healthy, but also to shape governance, to shape privacy issues, and of course to engage in security operations. Some of the challenges with this particular area is AI problem solving gets us to an answer, and in many ways we don't know how it got from A to Z. And this creates challenges in terms of the fundamentals of understanding artificial intelligence and its impact on societies and its ability to make decisions. Another area that I think is becoming more critical in terms of technology in the Indo-Pacific is quantum computing. And I think most of us, probably the oldest person on this call, probably remember the old Commodore 64 or VIC-20 computer where you had Eleanor would definitely not know this, but you had a cassette tape that you plugged in and it took about 10 minutes to upload a very, very simple program. But now with our 5G technologies, it takes 2 seconds to upload a very sophisticated program. So quantum computing is a kind of form of high-speed calculation, and it creates the ability to calculate and solve problems at extremely high speeds in a very I don't want to say secreted, but protected environment. It's very hard to decode, if not impossible, the quantum computing algorithms. So this is another area that I think we're competing in, and the competition is primarily between China and the United States, but there are also other hubs of competition. So Canada is one of the leaders. Japan is working very hard. South Korea is working hard. Of course, Germany is working hard. But in terms of the biggest competitors, it is really the United States and China. For different reasons. The United States has huge and very wealthy and very global social media companies that have a huge amount of data, but that data is used by the businesses to produce their wealth. In the Chinese context, most people use a digital device called WeChat, and the WeChat is, you can do everything with WeChat. You can buy your movie tickets, your airplane tickets, your train tickets, going in and out of the grocery store. You can do everything with it. So in the Chinese context, people, even if the average Chinese engaged with it 10 times a day, so that would be 14 billion data points a day, and you times that by 365, you can see that China is very, very wealthy in terms of the data it can use to start to refine its AI technologies and other technologies. So this is really another area that I think that we're competing with, and it's going to be important in how we think about the Indo-Pacific region, and the country or countries that are going to be the leaders in technology will probably be the leaders in shaping the region's architecture, its institutions, governance, privacy, technologies, biotechnologies. And that's really important because the leader will be able to set the rules, but also be able to produce the wealth generating ideas and technologies that will fundamentally reshape how wealth is distributed in the world. And I think this is a really important way for us to be thinking about technology in the Indo-Pacific. So the second area I want to mention is some of the institutions that are being used to protect and build resilience into these technology supply chains, but also develop the new technology supply chains. And one of the most important ones that will emerge as a primary vehicle is the so-called Arcus Agreement between the United States, Australia, and the UK. These three countries are on the same page of the book about most security issues, very deep levels of trust, and they have a strong forward-leaning presence in the Indo-Pacific. And they've agreed to cooperate on AI development, quantum computing, cybersecurity, hypersonic missiles, and there is also the nuclear submarine deal, which are not allowing the Australians to acquire nuclear weapons to be launched from submarines, but the submarines themselves are nuclear powered. And these are very, very sophisticated technologies, and the sophisticated technologies that are being transferred means that these countries will synergize and hybridize a lot of their R&D in these particular areas. And this will give them a critical mass of countries to compete with, in this case, China. And I think that's really, really important, thinking about AUKUS as a set of like-minded countries that can build a firewall in these particular technologies and use the latest innovation, the biggest markets, to drive innovation and to really out-compete, in this case, China on in these particular areas. So we've also seen the Quad, in some ways, be part of the technology and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, called the Quad, has made several agreements to start to make specific technologies, and here we're talking about 5G technology, we're talking about standards in telecommunication and digital economy, and what the Quad countries, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, have come to the table and said, we're going to start to protect certain technologies and selectively diversify those certain technologies from and away from the Chinese market, and put them within a group of like-minded countries. And the idea is, again, to create a firewall where these technologies are primarily built and innovated and distributed to trusted partners. And that Quad represents one of those institutions aside from the Arcus Agreement. In September 2021 and March 2021 and September 2021, at the virtual and the live summit, Quad Summit, the four leaders made strong commitments to ensure that the Quad is really the central institution that's going to start to help build resilience into these technological supply chains so that they can compete more effectively with China, but also insulate them from the geopolitical problems that we're facing in the strategic competition with China. We also see a few other areas that I think the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative between Australia, India, and Japan will be important. We also see some commitment between Japan bilaterally, for example, with Singapore or with Canada or other countries, to invest in AI and quantum computing, to invest in cybersecurity. And I think these are really, really important steps in Japan's own hardening of its economic security and building strong partnerships and being part of the rule-making process in these critical technologies. My last point, before we open up the floor to communication with everyone, is why is this so important? And there's a common expression that we use is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of economic policy, and of course in terms of technology policies within the region. And there's a concern that if there's not a more proactive grouping of countries that can ensure that AI, quantum computing, and these other technologies I mentioned are not dominated by, or that are ensure that they're dominated by open and free societies, that it has repercussions for this region's development in terms of privacy, in terms of the place of government in economies, in terms of the standards of the digital economy, in terms of the kinds of transparency and rules that will be used to negotiate commerce moving forward. So there's a real strong sense that countries like Japan and Australia and India and the United States and Canada and Germany and others, that they really want to ensure that technology in this region is primarily dominated by like-minded countries that share similar values, that really put rule of law first, transparency first, and this is really meant to ensure that we don't see an expansion of authoritarian governance that infringes upon privacy, of preventing the use of technology to monitor citizens in inappropriate ways. And if you look at Minister Motegi's comments about economic security and AI and technology in general, there's a real clear focus on this idea that we need to develop technologies, but we need to ensure that we protect the privacy and the rights of our citizens from not only other governments, but of course their own government. And this is really a somewhat of a hypocritical aspect of the Japanese policy, because if you take a look at Japan's view on, for example, human security, they're not really supporters of the responsibility to protect our argument. They're more about the idea of about ensuring that human security is about allowing people to develop relatively free in their respective societies. So in the case of the technology in the Indo-Pacific, Japan is very much about ensuring that they're part of the rules-making process, limiting the role of government, and ensuring that technology really develops along a transparent rules-based process. So that's kind of my 3 points: understanding which technologies are important, what are the institutions, and I mentioned AUKUS and the Quad and the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, as well as bilateral agreements, and then lastly, why it's important. And I'll just re-emphasize that if authoritarian states are the leaders in these areas, then those technologies reflect authoritarian values and authoritarian government models. And ultimately, I think that they will have negative ramifications for freer and open societies like Japan or Australia or Canada, United States, and India. And this is why I think it's really critical, and it is a critical area of competition, perhaps the area of critical competition in the Indo-Pacific.
Looks like there isn't so much information about the importance of developing new technologies in the popular press or the mass media nowadays, and it looks like they're so important. I mean, this focus is important. The politicians, obviously, the governments, they understand the importance of developing these technologies and keeping their, let's say, keeping ahead of the competitors whenever it is possible. And I wonder, why is this gap, between the information which is delivered to the general public and the way that the governments think about it? Why isn't there more information about this?
So that's a great question, Maya. And I think first, it's moved very, very quickly. I think there was a book by Li Kaifeng. It's called AI Superpowers that came out maybe 4 years ago. And it really came, I think it was an abrupt wake-up call for the American technology industry that China was very, very data-rich, and it was using the data that they have in their system to accelerate their AI development. And we saw China really move very, very quickly in terms of AI and quantum computing. And I think this was a wake-up call for the United States technology industry and its social media giants, but also the security establishment and the government. And I think that the United States, of course, and other countries became very aware that these areas were critical areas of critical areas of competition that will shape societies and governance in ways that we didn't think about. I mentioned how fast this has come, and I think that the public hasn't been able to keep up in terms of what these technologies mean for everyday life in Tokyo or Seoul or Taipei or Beijing or Washington, and what are the broader implications. And this is probably partly related to the lack of good information from governments, but also very much related to the speed of development. And for all of us, if we just think about 10 years ago, none of us probably had an iPhone, but now you're probably on your third or fourth kid or third or fourth iPhone. And we've seen so much technological development. Really, it speaks to the speed of change, and that speed of change is accelerating.
Yes, it is indeed. And I wonder when the societies will realize how speedy those developments are.
That's a good question.
Or many of us have not realized how quickly these technologies have been developed and how important it is to follow those developments and also to realize how they will shape the future. So, Eleanor and Chowting, if you have anything, any comments, well, let us know about them too.
Thank you very much for your speech. I think you are talking about a very important topic about the technological dimension of geopolitics. So this is really important dimension. Actually, I have a technological background, so as one software engineer, I think technology should be value-free. Technology is not related to geopolitics, but actually it's not. Technology is a very important part of the geopolitical competition. You have mentioned WeChat. I think this is a perfect example about the geopolitics of technology. The WeChat is really a super application developed by Tencent. Tencent is one Chinese company located in Shenzhen. Actually, WeChat is different from WhatsApp or any other mobile app application. WeChat is actually an OS operating system. So in WeChat, the third-party developer can develop many different applications. So WeChat is actually an OS, very powerful. You really can do everything. But on the other hand, WeChat is strictly controlled by Chinese authority. There is very strict censorship. So for some information from outside China is not allowed to spread in WeChat. They have very powerful censorship mechanism. That means there is a strong censorship for Western information on WeChat. On the other hand, we have seen the Trump administration has tried to ban WeChat in the U.S. because Trump administration believed that WeChat can have national security threat for the U.S. So this is a typical example that technology is related to geopolitical competition between great powers. WeChat is one example. So Professor Nagy has also mentioned Arcus and Quad. I think this is another example. For me, in my opinion, Quad and Arcus are very important parts of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the U.S. Originally, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the U.S. is one geopolitical strategy. That means security and military are very important element of our Indo-Pacific strategy. But now the U.S. has realized the economic and technological dimension are also very important in order to compete against China, because China's Belt and Road Initiative is normally a geo-economic strategy. Therefore, economic development, technological cooperation are China's advantage. So, in order to compete against the BRI, the U.S. must strengthen the economic and technological dimension of Indo-Pacific strategy. That's why we have seen the U.S. has emphasized the technological dimension of Quad and the Arcus. For Arcus, so the technology cooperation between the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. in terms of AI, telecommunication, and quantum computing. For Quad, there is also technological cooperation. Recently, the U.S. Department of Commerce has made the decision that the U.S. will define. The U.S. will have a so-called Indo-Pacific economic framework strategy, and the digital trade is a very important element of the economic framework. I think the U.S. has realized that the digital economy is very important if they want to win the competition over China. On the other hand, from China's perspective, the so-called digital economy is also very important. Professor Nagy, I'm not sure if you know the international relations scholar of China from Tsinghua University, Professor Yan Xuetong.
Yes, of course.
Yan Xuetong is a famous international relations expert in China, and he has made it very clear now that strategic competition between great powers is no longer about traditional industry, agriculture. It's more about the digital economy. And China has invested a lot of resources in digital economy. And then, of course, China has made a huge progress. So China has also realized the importance of digital economy. I think digital economy is related to technology as well. So both China and the U.S. have realized the importance of digital economy. Both have invested a lot of resources. Both have tried to cooperate with their respective airlines and partners. So we have seen a new dimension of geopolitical competition, which is technology, especially between China and the U.S. So it's really important to discuss the details of the technological competition. I think this can be the meaning of today's discussion. Thank you. This is comments from my side.
Thank you very much, Xiaoting. And I think you really emphasized emphasize my point. So it's great that we're on the same page of the book, but also I think you brought in new information in terms of really how China is also defining the region's competition in terms of who dominates the technologies will dominate the region. And I think that's a very important aspect of thinking about this. And you also touched upon the special nature of the WeChat operating system and why if that model is spread throughout the region, may be problematic for some countries such as Japan or South Korea or political entities like Taiwan. Eleanor, you had something to share as well?
Sure, I'd be happy to share some thoughts that perhaps I don't think have been touched on yet. And I guess I can even talk a little bit about my interview with former Prime Minister Abe, since I know Stephen has shared it with so many people, if I remember correctly, and
Yes.
which is very kind of you, always following my work. So I guess first I'll touch on something I don't think has been talked about, which is what makes the backbone of this whole technological revolution, depending on how you look at it, which is the talent component. I've written about the talent component in regards to semiconductors specifically with a friend of mine last year on how there is definitely a skill shortage, at the very least, on U.S. partners and allies side, but even that of China as well, which is one of the reasons why Taiwan has taken light of this. And last year, if I remember, I think it was April, I want to say, they prohibited any sort of talent to come from the mainland. And actually, just a few weeks ago, in light of that, or somewhat relating to that, some Taiwanese investigators, they did raid Chinese chip talent poachers because they are very concerned. I believe the Taiwanese government is very concerned about what information mainland Chinese STEM workers may acquire to then take back to the mainland, and then that does tie into the broader technological competition, which, as I think Stephen Chouting and others do know, it's not particularly just a U.S. versus China thing. There are so many other players, state and non-state actors, who are involved in this. And the other thing that I do want to touch upon, which both of you mentioned, the Quad, which is one thing that I found pretty heartening, was the Quad Fellowship. So yes, exactly. And they are actually, for anybody who knows STEM workers who are looking for a job, the Quad Fellowship is actually taking applications right now. So for anybody with math, technological, and other talents, feel free to apply. Just pulling that plug out there. So those are some of the things that I want to touch upon. And I guess in regards to my interview with Abe, I did mention in my piece that economic security, which I kind of see as a buzzword these days, is something that Prime Minister Abe, rightfully, I would say, is very concerned about. And that's the reason why, the Japanese government has decided to have a partnership with TSMC, Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And he also did point out that it is one of the first times the Japanese government is actually providing assistance to foreign firms to make an investment in Japan. So just that partnership in and of itself speaks volumes to the Japanese government's trajectory of making economic security a pillar of their foreign policy. So I'll end there just to see what kind of comments or reactions I spark.
So I think it's a great point that you mentioned about the talent gap, or the dearth in talent, lack of talent, not just in the United States, but in other places. And if you followed Matsubara Mihoko's work, she pointed out that Japan needs about, I think, 4,000 or 5,000 graduates a year, and it doesn't even have a quarter of that. And I think in the United States as well, China has a lot of highly skilled people, but the top skilled people seem to be still concentrated in Silicon Valley. But I think you're correct. There's not enough talent in these particular areas, and I think the states understand that. There is growing concern about poaching of talent, and some of the top talent in China actually came from the United States, and I think that's a really indication that there's going to be competition for those jobs moving forward. Your point about Japan and Prime Minister Abe's comment, yes, economic security is everywhere now, and if you follow what the discourse in Japan, as I know you do, everything is seen through the lens of economic security. And even if you look at Japan's policies towards Russia in the wake of its invasion of Iraq or Ukraine, that it's a very good example of the kind of economic security policies they're testing. How to use sanctions effectively, how to insulate the economy and make it more resilient, how to diversify, and how to use technology in those areas. And that's a really, really interesting space to look forward on. Lastly, again, I don't think this is just about Japan and the US and others thinking about technology. You brought up China, but I also think other countries are thinking about technology and how they can use it to to deal with some of the sanctions and challenges they face. And here I'm thinking about North Korea, I'm thinking about Iran, and I'm thinking about Russia investing in cyber currencies or cryptocurrencies. They're using actively hacking and other forms of technologies in terms of theft, both intellectual property and real money. So we're seeing technology being a real space where states can push their interests and non-state actors can push their interests without moving directly into kinetic conflict. And this is a bit scary because we don't know the direction it's going to go.
Professor Nagy, I want to talk about another related topic, digital sovereignty. So
Yep.
today is era of internet. Internet is playing key role in many dimensions. So I think the concept of cyber sovereignty or digital sovereignty in Europe is really interesting. So US has invented the internet. I think the US is the most powerful player in internet. Therefore, US has always promoted a free and open internet. But other great powers have different ideas. For example, Russia has actually invented the concept of cyber sovereignty, and China has embraced this idea. So China and Russia have very actively promoted cyber sovereignty. So they do believe the government, the state, should have the control over internet. This is their idea. Okay, so the state must play key role in controlling the internet. Actually, China has developed a very powerful technology in controlling internet inside China. China has so-called a digital Great Firewall, very powerful. China can control any information if they want, and China can stop any information if they don't like. Okay, so I mean the technological capacity of Chinese government is really very powerful in terms of digital sovereignty. So China and Russia are one model, and of course I have talked about the US. So I think the US is another model, which means they promote free and open internet. On the other hand, there are big companies. Big technological companies have huge power over internet. We have seen Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have banned Donald Trump after the incident in January 6, 2021. So we have seen that the technological companies have huge power over the government. This is unbelievable, unthinkable from Chinese and Russia perspective, because they believe the government should be most powerful. But in American model, it's different. The big companies have huge power. So in addition to Chinese and American model, we have an European model, EU model. So EU has also the idea of promoting digital sovereignty. For EU, I think they are between China and the US. On the one hand, they believe the authorities must have sovereignty over internet. On the other hand, they dislike the idea of China to have censorship. So they believe a free and open internet is important to protect EU values. So we have seen EU's approach is really different. They have emphasized the importance of regulation. EU has published the first regulation of internet, GPDR. Okay, so many countries are very interested in the EU model. I think Japan and India are trying to copy this model to regulate their respective internet. So I mean, EU has invented a new model. They emphasize the importance of regulation. Of course, they also emphasize the internet must be used to promote EU's values. This is also the characteristics of EU model. So in summary, I have seen three different models in terms of digital sovereignty. American model, Chinese model, and the EU model. They have different emphasis. So this is really interesting. And that means in the internet domain, there is also competition of different ideas, different governance model. That means the internet is not value free. It's also related to geopolitics. This is my observation.
That's an excellent summation, Xiaoting, and I think it's sometimes this was an expression that I heard at a G0 summit here in Tokyo a couple of years ago. Data poverty. So countries like the United States or Canada or Japan, we're data poor because corporates use our data to make money, and in the Chinese context, the Chinese citizens are data poor as well because the government uses data for citizens to control citizens, and the European Union is trying to find a way to use regulation to protect the privacy and perhaps commodify the data of citizens for citizens rather than for big business. But I think that's really illustrates my point about technology and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific as to why who makes the rules matters, and that it's not necessary that a U.S.-led Indo-Pacific may not be in interest of all of us. China-led region may not be in the interest of all of us. The EU provides potentially another way we could think about technology and standard setting and how it will affect governance and privacy and our lives. So really good point. Thank you.
Since we're talking about technology and we're talking about how the digital revolution is worth following, as I know Stephen did, perhaps I can incorporate some recommendations as the places to read if you're interested in a specific technological application like semiconductors or AI or even biopharmacy. That's another I would say area worth looking at, as well as robotics. So Washington-based think tank CSET, which is the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, they publish great work, obviously more from a Washington perspective, just because they do provide policy prescriptions to the U.S. government as well, and a lot of their employees do end up working for the government. Case in point, their founder actually now works for the Biden administration. So CSET, they publish great work, and I also have a friend working there, so I will promote his work there as well shamelessly. And then, so CSET is one. ITIF, I believe it stands for Information Technology Information Foundation or something like that. If you type ITIF and then maybe type the word technology afterwards, you might find it in Google. So that's another one worth looking at. And I think that one provides more of a sectoral perspective as well, because it's not just a matter of we need to be able to understand what governments think, but we also need to understand and decipher what business entities, what stakes they have in regards to this whole technological competition as well. And I think as Xiaoting put it, I do want to also say that I totally agree with him in that, the overall strategic competition between US and China, a few years ago, we talked mostly about trade, mostly when Trump was in office. But really, what's really underlying this competition is technology. I firmly believe that, and I'm very glad that the Indo-Pacific frameworks like the Quad have taken wind of that, just to see the evolution of the different statements that have come out and that have emphasized critical and emerging techs as well as supply chain resiliency. I've noticed that, I'm not sure, Stephen, if you agree with me, but that's something that I've noticed, and that's something that I'm glad that they are taking wind of. Of course, so much work has yet to be done, which is what is reinforcing my first point as to why it's so important to look into this space. So thanks again.
Yeah, Eleanor, I would agree. And I think the problem when we think about technology, it's really difficult to articulate to get support from our political stakeholders as ordinary societies and businesses. What do we mean by technology? How does it impact us directly? What is the relation between the technologies and, again, what I mentioned, governance, privacy, standard settings? These are all very, very complicated issues. And in regions that's so heterogeneous as the Indo-Pacific, that you have South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Singapore, Indonesia, Australia, it goes on and on and on. It's very heterogeneous, and it raises questions of how effective a larger group of countries can be at creating the technologies that will be the standards for the future, or do we need minilaterals like AUKUS or the Quad to be the kind of engines of innovation and standard setting that will be adopted by others? And at this stage, I don't know, but it's it is the central core of the competition within the region. Rather than a Cold War, I think it's a tech war or a tech competition. And that's going to really shape everything about this region's characteristics and how we engage with it going forward.
Yes, I agree. And I'll just make one more point, which I don't remember who made this point earlier, but I think there's a talk about how difficult it is to convey to the general public, in Japan or Taiwan, China, whatever, and the US, of course, about the importance of critical technologies like semiconductors. But one thing I've taken note of since particularly COVID-19, which has really unveiled some of the supply chain vulnerabilities that we have here in the United States, is the fact that when it's only when there's an acute shortage of something such as semiconductors, and not just for like cars or like thereby causing increase in prices and surge in demands of like electronics like MacBooks or whatever. That's when the general public, I feel like, takes note of just how important it is to first of all be aware that there is such a space as this technological revolution, as well as the competition aspect of it as well, but that they are part of this narrative. And I don't think that is unique to the United States. But I would say, as someone from the Midwest and as someone who was in the Midwest when COVID started and up until last July, I will say that when semiconductors was talked about quite a bit in Washington, it was also talked quite a bit about it in the Midwest as well, but in a different aspect, though, more in terms of like, well, it's I've noticed that car prices, particularly used ones, are getting more expensive, and there are now more cars that are being stored in university parking lots because they, companies like in Indiana, we have a Subaru factory. First of all, we have other, we actually, I think per capita, we have the most Japanese companies in any state in the U.S. So those are things that are talked about. I think that might continue, but it may gradually become so, depending on how the respective governments handle these choke points, that there might be a growing awareness of the critical, the technological revolution in the competition aspect, but it will be gradual. I don't think it's going to happen, tomorrow or, the day.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think right now we're all about supply chains because it's very tangible.
Exactly.
But technology is less tangible. It's the next step up from supply chains. So when we can't get our Toyota Prius or whatever because, well, now nickel prices are up and semiconductors or chips have bottlenecks, then the questions start to be asked. But I don't know if there's a direct line of understanding between the technologies and supply chains and how that's related to geopolitics, or at least not yet.
Rich, hello. Thank you very much for coming up.
Thank you, Maya, and everybody. I appreciate it. Fascinating discussion, and it is complex and nuanced, as everybody was saying. But I have a slightly different perspective, maybe even though, like Eleanor, I'm originally a Midwesterner, grew up in Minnesota, and have lived around the world, many places in them. But
aren't you a Southern Canadian?
Yes, I'm a Southern Canadian. Canada somehow relinquished. In fact, I used to represent Polaris in lawsuits, and so I'd fly up to their plant in northern Minnesota, and there was right near the plant there was a sign that said to the right Polaris, to the left was Canada. Right, there's no state. Just go across the road and there's Canada. So that's what it's like up there. But what I was wanting to say was that I appreciate all the focus on nuance, and it's true, but I think it's really pretty stark right now. And I think the war in Ukraine has kind of made it clear. It's not just politically, but technologically. I think this is the direction it's going to go. We've got autocracy versus democracy. This is how I see the world going. And I think it's kind of black and white. And we've been trying to, and by the way, Stefan mentioned Henry Kissinger, who I always admired. He has such a cool sounding voice and he's brilliant, obviously. But looking back now, I kind of think he misjudged China and the effect of engaging with China. He didn't understand the culture enough, and I think he may have thought China was another Japan. And I think he was just mistaken. I think any attempts to kind of bring China into the West are ill-fated. It just doesn't seem to work. It's a different set of cultures. And so what I see is kind of a stark difference between the kind of the East and the West, not the geographic East and West, but the cultural East and West. And I'm kind of wondering if it's possible for technology to kind of be separated and for us to have two separate technologies. You guys talked a little bit about 5G and potentially 6G, and Cao Tong mentioned WeChat and others, and so there's a lot of social media technology. I'm not concerned about that because I think you can have, the West can have its Facebook and, WeChat in China, and I don't think that's that big a deal. But for things like self-drive, 5G, and other forms of communication between objects or other media that facilitates communication between cars and infrastructure and between cars and other cars is very critical. And so I kind of just wonder if I'm oversimplifying it. But the way I see it right now, unless the leadership changes in Russia and China, there's a real polar divide, and we're all trying to act as though we can get along, but it doesn't look that way to me. I see a big block of autocratic countries, and then you know, a whole bunch of democratic countries that are messy and have a lot of problems, including the U.S. But it's a fundamentally different system, I think. And somebody mentioned like the European version, the American version, and maybe the Chinese version. And I think I don't see as big a difference between the European and the American version. I think America is it's a messier democracy. It's slower for things like GDPR to get implemented, but people want that because data privacy is something that everybody wants. I believe individuals, as soon as they become aware of it and they are conscious of the possibility of it, they want it. And it's just that the big tech companies have, of course, fought that. So it's not so much a difference in governance as a difference in the ability of the big tech companies to kind of lobby for technological freedom, and they're the ones that didn't want to have a GDPR-like regulation in the United States. But California has adopted one, or they've tried to, and it's kind of moving in fits and spurts. But I guess this is a question for you folks that really study international relations more than I do as a casual observer. But am I overstating this? Is it not that simple? It seems to me like there's a stark difference between the East and the West, and I would include Taiwan in the West, by the way. Taiwan and Korea and Japan seem to me like countries that at least want to have a democratic base. Am I oversimplifying?
So, by chance today, I just spoke to a Russian friend about what was happening there, and we were talking about how they access the world. And for the more educated people, they want to access the world, and to access the world, they use Instagram, and they use Telegram, and they use Facebook. Some will use WeChat, some will use Line, some will use WhatsApp. So it appears that a certain part of Russia is very much interested in finding out about what's happening outside the world in that context. And it was only until recently that the Russians turned off these systems. I don't know how you do it, but turned off the access to Facebook and other systems, so they couldn't get information about the Ukraine. I'm not Chinese, but and many of my Chinese colleagues have Facebook accounts, and they use VPNs to get over the Great Wall, and they're very interested in what's happening outside the world. But for the average Joe or Liu, I don't think they really care, right? Their concerns are local. And in that sense, they don't really care what Le Monde or BBC or The National or Washington Post says about anything. One, because they can't read the languages, and two, because it's just not in their worldview. So the question is if do they have such staunch divides? I'm not sure if they do, if they have a choice. And here I'd like maybe Chao Ting to share his views on this, because I'm not a Chinese national. But my sense is if people have a choice, they'll be more, they prefer a more open system.
And to be clear, Stephen, thank you. That's on point. But I wasn't necessarily talking about what the individuals wanted, because I think people are kind of the same the world over. I was talking about the power systems in place and kind of what systems they dictate in terms of governance.
Yeah. Well, Russia has shifted because of pressure from the West. And China has closed their internet system for many, many years, and it continues to tighten. But even in the Chinese context, it's cyclic. So if you were to go to Beijing in the autumn this year or in the spring this year, what you'll find out is the VPN systems don't work as well. You'll be more in a Chinese news bubble, and this will affect your ability to get information from the outside. But in a year, that bubble may lighten up. So I think the government as well understands the need for a nuanced approach, and just, a great firewall that lets nothing in is also detrimental for China. So I think it's not so black and white. I think there's actually quite gray. And here, Chao Ting, I'd like to hear your view.
Okay, Stephen. So I agree with you. I think that for the most ordinary Chinese people, they don't care about the outside world, and their opinion is shaped by the Chinese authority, by the Chinese social media. For example, they receive information from WeChat and Weibo, and on these platforms, the Chinese propaganda department has really the power to shape the information flow. And for Chinese intellectuals, many of them are using VPN, but according to my observation, they have received information from outside world, from Western media, but actually this have strengthened their perception that the Western countries are hostile to China. So the U.S. has a grand strategy to contain China strategically, and they want to subvert the Chinese regime politically, and they want to stop Chinese Chinese development economically. So I think the Chinese elites and the Chinese ordinary people are quite hostile to Western countries, even without a great firewall. So this is the current situation. I think the Chinese propaganda department has made a very good job to convince Chinese people that the Western countries want to contain China. Most people are convinced for this.
Shell, thank you for coming up.
Hi,
Good evening
everyone.
to you.
Good evening to you all, and thank you, Professor Nagy. Very insightful lecture. My name is Shell. I'm from I'm Uyghur from the China's Xinjiang region, born and raised in Japan and Australia. Now I'm working in Tokyo, and just wanted to add a couple of points from Japan's perspective, and if anyone has any opinion or views, I would like to hear it. So in Japan, this whole conversation surrounding technology and supply chains from this security perspective hasn't really developed, to be very honest. I mean, in my opinion, due to many reasons. I think a couple of reasons would be of course the limitation of the central government's functions, and limitation of manpower, and limitation of legal frameworks, and these we all know. I think this month the person leading the economic security, I forgot his name, but he
Hayashi.
小林さんじゃなくてですね、he got reprimanded and he resigned. He was the head of the economic security at the National Security Council, and which focused on all the the four key areas such as supply chain, basic infra, and basic the technology, and also intellectual properties and stuff like that. But this whole conversation is still kind of like not very active. It's not very proactive due to those limitations at Kasumigaseki, in my opinion, and because of that, it's not really those messages are not effectively sent out to the private sectors, because at the end of the day, private sectors are the the leading powers in these areas. So those messages are not received well as well, not by the mega banks, not by the Keidanren, or not by the mega corporations in Japan. I think that's my opinion. If you have any anything about it, thank you.
So thanks very much, Shell. I'm really happy to hear your voice, and you bring some good insight. And two things I want to just highlight, because you said you're from the Uyghur background, and I think you obviously know how technology has been used on the Uyghur community over the past 6 or 7 years to monitor and control their community. So I think that really speaks to why values are important in terms of technology, and why we can't have a valueless technology. But the gap between the business community and economic security, the government's economic security policy, I think that is really, really clear. And I think if you saw the recent bill on economic security, that there was a lot of pushback from the Keidanren in that it really, I guess their biggest pushback is they don't know, everything could be considered economic security. And as a result, it created problems in terms of how they interpret their business. So that suggests that the Japanese government's definition, or the core areas that they're interested in, needs to be defined better, so that businesses will be able to better negotiate the Chinese market in particular, because this is where I think it's mostly targeted at, and where the Japanese business community has the most to lose if the policy is not crafted well. I do think there's also a gap between these top tier businesses in Japan and what is the diplomatic way to put this, the non-digital world of Japanese bureaucracy. Is that the right way to say this diplomatically? And as a result, I think there might be some lag in terms of how the government is thinking about this, conceptualizing this, and putting it onto paper, and how businesses are actually experiencing what's happened in the market. And just to give you some insight, when I was in Hong Kong working, I interviewed about 150 Japanese company presidents, and one of the consistent themes is we have more geopolitical problems in China. We have to figure out how to deal with it, but we want to stay in the market. And they found creative ways to deal with the challenges in the market that were in part cooperation with the government, but also just with their other business partners that were looking at best practices to overcome some of the challenges in the Chinese market. So I think it's a bit of a mix. What do you think?
Thank you. Yeah, I pretty much agree with what you said, but I think still in Japan, those big banks and those big corporations still regard this entire issue as something very mendokusai, something very complex and annoying, and they're trying to push, kind of delay the timing. They push back the timing way they have to deal with this, and it's something very unhealthy, in my opinion. So I hope the more kind of interactive and healthy, productive conversations are going to take place, and also the reality of China needs to be understood both at the government and also at the private sector as well, and in both policy making wise and also natural competition wise, the market competition wise, and that's my opinion. And earlier a lot of things were mentioned, especially in Chinese market. Sometimes I think we have to understand those giant tech companies and even the startups and unicorn companies with huge market caps and stuff like that. They are all could be used as if they're part of the the security apparatus of the central government in China. So it's the nature of the functionality is very different compared to those companies in Japan and the US. And the nature of the reality needs to be understood both by Keidane and at Kasumi Gaseki, in my opinion. But thank you.
You make a really good point, and if you've looked at, and I think Eleanor talked about this in terms of a lack of specialists, and I think Chao-Ting and Chao-Ting talked about the different frameworks for controlling technology, but I think one area that we haven't mentioned that you touch upon is how technology actually isn't separated from the political system in the Chinese context. And if you look at the Chinese context of the past 6 or 7 years, the party has become more embedded in society, more embedded in both public organizations and even private organizations. So private organizations have to have a party secretariat that ensures that business activities are in line with whatever the current policies of the party is. And this is a challenge, right? At this particular stage, then we wonder, what is the division between government and business, or in this case, the division between technology and the government? And I think this is probably one of the biggest questions about Huawei, in that, of course, they had a former PLA officer running the business, but the fact that there's a party secretary within the business, it really raises questions about how independent the business is, and if that's the case, where technology can be used and where it can't be used. And again, this is another element of the technology and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, is that it's a totally different way to think about the use of technology, but also the separation between the government and business and rule of law. And I think this is an area as well that we need to think about in terms of this competition.
Thank you. Just quickly, one point. As you mentioned, in the UK, I think this January there's a new law called the National Security and Investment Act, which so basically monitors any direct investment involving mergers and acquisition or buyouts from foreign companies in the areas involving sensitive materials. Mm-hmm. So these are something we haven't seen yet, I think, in Japan. Mm-hmm. And this is a very we haven't those kind of entire conversation hasn't developed into that level yet. But because sorry, your comment just reminded me of this new law in the UK.
Thanks, Shel. Appreciate the engagement.
So, excuse me, Stephen, I want to follow up your point about the relationship between business and politics. I think this is really the fundamental difference between China and Western countries. So I think the Western people have a typical perspective from the Western perspective, when they observe the Chinese situation. For example, the Western media and Western intellectuals are always asking the question: how independent Chinese business is from the Chinese government? For me, this question makes no sense. This question has no any sense, because in China there is no really private enterprise in terms of a big giant technology company. For example, Huawei, Tencent, and Alibaba, all of them are private company. But so what? They are still under the full control of Chinese party and government. They are not independent. Actually, for these companies, they are very proud to cooperate with Chinese authorities. That means they are very close to the power. In China, for example, like Huawei, it's a private owned company. But on the other hand, telecommunication network is extremely important for Chinese party and government. So if you don't have very close relationship with the regime, it's impossible for you to make a business in telecommunication domain. So there is no any doubt Huawei has very strong connection with Chinese government. There is no any doubt. But, of course, there is no evidence. Huawei is 100% owned by its employees. It's right, but on the other hand, it makes no sense.
Absolutely.
Any private company is under control of Chinese government. So even they are 100% private company. So I think the Western people have the Western way of thinking, Western mentality, because in Western countries, business is independent from government. Market is separated from the authorities. But in China, they are the same, even they are the private company. So this is a fundamental difference. I think the Western people must understand Chinese reality. All the Chinese companies, either state-owned enterprise or 100% private companies, they are fully under control of Chinese party.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it's a very important part in terms of how we're thinking about technological competition moving forward. Great point, Shouting. Thank you.
That was actually the point I was trying to make when I said I think it's not that subtle. I see a very kind of a stark difference, and I just really wonder if we're all being naive. As much as I would love for China and Western countries to be able to continue to cooperate and working together, it seems like they're marching down a two separate paths, and people don't want to say it, but it doesn't look very good to me. The future.
Yeah, I think that if you read more specialized stuff, there's general, I think, consensus that we're moving towards a bifurcated or a divided technological sphere, tech Cold War, and this will be a challenge in terms of, for businesses, they'll have to develop two different ecosystems, one for an open system, one for a closed system, and then probably a third that allows for a safe crossing between those two systems. And this will be an area of very, very proactive exploitation and probably intellectual property theft moving forward. It's a fascinating space to watch, definitely.
Rich, you mentioned also that we're probably going to see democracy versus technocracy. That's the that's the opposition, or what's sorry, words really escape me sometimes. So hopefully rules will be decided, and they will be really observed by the different players, the leaders as well, and also by the countries that follow the leaders in their footsteps. And from me, once again, thank you to everybody who shared, Eleanor, Chao-Ting, Shell, Rich, all of you, for coming up here, sharing your observations, your work also, and your opinions. To everybody who stayed with us in the audience and listened, this has been a great discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, You can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.